give you a little bit of background on John Lenders. John Lenders has been a member of the State Parliament since 1999. During that time he served in a range of positions, most notably as Minister of Education in the Bracks government and Treasurer in the Brumby government. He is currently Leader of the Opposition in the Legislative Council and holds a number of shadow ministries. We're delighted to give him this opportunity to look back on his involvement in community, church and politics and to reflect on their intersections. Let us welcome John Lenders.
Well, thank you very much, Cheryl, for that kind welcome and the invitation to reflect on those three things, and I certainly will. But I think the main thing tonight I really want to reflect on in launching Philip's book is really sort of the contribution of religion to Australian society and the perspective from someone inside government. And my focus of my address will be probably more with how government makes decisions and a reflection on that than the more general reflection on where society is. But in that 15 years, I also, as I said, was a minister for 9 years. So during a lot of that time, many decisions would be made. And often the foundation or the basis of those decisions is something often that people don't reflect very much on. Sometimes these things just happen. I'd like to reflect a bit about the interaction and the why. But I think in opening observations, I'd make a brief observation on the federal, because that's so much more meaning to many of us, before going into the state, in which I think I have perhaps a greater insight into. But I think there's probably no better way to start talking of where life ethics, faith in Australian society, than starting with our federal leaders. And I don't know how many people had the opportunity to look at the Compass program on the ABC in the last couple of weeks. And I'll briefly reflect on that, because I think that's a great starting point for this discussion. So for those who haven't seen it, Compass had two particular episodes, and they titled the episodes God in the Lodge, was how they described it. And then they go through chronologically through all Australia's Prime Ministers, and I won't repeat that, but I draw a few observations again about the role of faith in particular government decisions, which the Compass program touched on. The first observation was it said that all Australian Prime Ministers professed to be Christians other than Gough Whitlam and Julia Gillard, who said they were agnostics, but came from a Christian faith tradition in their early lives. Well, Bob Hawke actually was a third. The one that, in a sense, that I find the most interesting with the Labor Party tradition is Ben Chifley's Light on the Hill. Now, having been a member of the Labor Party for, I think, 28 years now, I've heard Light on the Hill used on so many occasions as sort of this value underpinning for everything. And it's interesting, according to the Compass program, and when you actually reflect on it, that the Light on the Hill is actually very much based on the Sermon on the Mount. And it's interesting, again, it goes to a central thing, where do values come from? We're in a society, and going back to the book that I've got the privilege of launching here today, we have a lot of demographic material, we have a lot of census material, but we come increasingly to a view that many people do not see values or Christian values as an underpinning. They talk about spirituality, they talk about a greater value base, they talk about a range of things, which Philip identifies and often identify in the book. But it is interesting when something is, again, such a centre part of, left of centre politics in Australia, the Light on the Hill, and everything that means, when the underpinning is ultimately the Sermon on the Mount. And I think this is one of these almost silent and hidden things about values in government and how governments make decisions, that people often make them on Christian beliefs or Judaic beliefs without realising that is actually the source of much of this. I mentioned before that I had the privilege of going to this Council of Australian Governments meetings, many of them, these two-day meetings of First Ministers and Treasurers. If there was a single thing that often seemed to be the focus of these meetings, it was how do you respond to a crisis, whether it be the global financial crisis and the consequences to that, or whether it be, not long afterwards, the bushfire response in Victoria, which also had a national response to it. And what's the underpinning? And I was reflecting after Philip asked me to give this address on, what were the underpinnings of this? And I guess increasingly I've come to the observation here, people in government respond to things almost without identifying a value underpinning it. And that seems to be the feature of so much of what my observations from being involved in government at a number of levels would be, but when you try to identify, well, what was our response to the global financial crisis? The first discussion we would have is, you need to protect the financial system so you can keep jobs. So there becomes a whole issue here, well, what is the virtue of keeping jobs? Part of that is an underpinning of the dignity that goes with it, the respect for humans, the ability of society to do things if people are in meaningful, well-paid employment. But it's not really articulated other than we need to stabilise, you have to stop runs on banks. If you have runs on banks, you lose jobs. If you have, there's a whole range of things that come from this, that people losing their retirement income. But it's never quite articulated at the very start as to the why. It's the how. One thing I'll talk about federal observations is my time on the staff of the Federal Immigration and Multicultural Affairs Minister in the late 1980s, Clyde Holding. It was fascinating at that time because there was a massive debate on immigration. So we had about one, and it's no different now, we had about 1.5 million people a year would take the first step of going to an Australian embassy or post somewhere in the world to say, I want to come to Australia. The end point was 180,000 people would come to Australia. So we had a filtering process that knocked out about 85% of the people. Now, those 1.5 million, probably half of them were fairly cursory applications, but the other half were very serious. The policy that really was, there was a balance between refugees, between family reunion, and essentially the economic needs of the economy, are really the three things we brought together. But nowhere in there, was there, again, quoting scripture, there was nothing from Matthew about exalt the least, there was nothing, from Leviticus about welcome the stranger. It was just, that's what you did. You had to be, you had to be good, if that's the word to use. It was an obligation to welcome refugees. There was an obligation to unite families, and then there was the harder economic one, obviously, of bringing in needed skills. So again, an interesting observation. It's one of the most, I guess, values-laden important decisions probably that a national government can make. And I'm not going to comment on the decisions or politics of it now, but it's obviously one that people feel strongly about for a whole range of reasons. And there was never really, in a formal sense, an underpinning of the why, as much the how. Now I'll move now on to some observations about the state. And state government here, and again on the issue of the role of religion, stating the obvious, we are a secular society. However, our head of state is also the head of the Church of England. Our parliament commences with the Lord's Prayer. But it's interesting when you actually watch when people get sworn in, a majority of our MPs in Victoria still swear on the Bible, or in some case the Torah or the Quran, but a majority still choose to swear on a holy book rather than take an affirmation. So there is still a majority who, for whatever reason, feel that is important. So the starting point is we are a secular state, and part of that permeates through. People are saying, well, if we're a secular state, we've got to leave our religious beliefs at the door. But this is where I guess the premise I make is, well, how can you do that when that is part of what you are? And secondly, they have permeated so much of what we see as now the secular humanist culture has so much of its strengths come out of the Christian and Jewish traditions in particular. But what is the social? If you sit around the table, and people in this room will have the same, when you sit around the table in Parliament, around a cabinet table, you meet with stakeholders or citizens, constituents, whatever. When you say what is the social, people will use language like Christian charity, you'll have languages like social justice, you'll have language like humanism, or we actually, as a Labor Party, actually had a document we printed out of our budget called A Fairer Victoria. And the underpinning of A Fairer Victoria was always that component. And whether you call it Christian charity, social justice, whatever you wish to call it, there was an underpinning that for government to operate fairly and to meet its duty, you had to seek to have a fairer Victoria. So we talked about it in those terms. And I'll touch again a bit later on the roles of the state, why so many of those values ultimately come from a Christian or Jewish tradition or from a value set, and whether it be in more modern times from parts of Hinduism or Islam or Buddhism, that religious perspective that there is an obligation of the citizen to actually look beyond themselves and make the world a better place.